Hello and welcome to Virtues of Peace. My name is Randy Olson, and I'm joined today by three wonderful people: Michael Buzzy, Sandra Weber, who's been joining us for all of the conversations about Adelaide Johnson's portrait monument, and Hope Elizabeth May, who's our subject of conversation today. Hope Elizabeth May has been deeply involved in the procedure for recreating a replica statue. And so we're continuing the conversation about that statue, and we're going to try to unpack why the statue helps us to unearth some of the linkages between the suffrage movement and the peace through law movement. And Hope is the president and founder of the Cora di Brazzà Foundation, which is where this show is sort of coming from. And one of the initiatives of the foundation is a project titled Forward into Light, which aims to uncover the linkages between the women's suffrage movement, women's suffrage movement and the peace through law movement. And so as a means to that end, Dr. May oversaw a project to create a replica of Adelaide Johnson's statue. And she included the inscription on the back, which was originally erased. And that inscription still hasn't been restored. And so in the process of repairing history, so to speak, this project got put in motion a couple of years ago. And so we're going to spend some time today talking about that. So in order to do that properly, I think that a narrative is something we need to build. And in order to build a narrative, we need to know a little bit about our characters and a little bit about those characters' motivations. So in this moment, I guess we're shifting into talking about Hope. And Hope, I'm really interested to begin with kind of how you developed your appreciation for history and how your academic background might have kind of pushed you in these kinds of historical directions, and starting the conversation there. So what kind of got you into this, Hope?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me as a guest of this show. I am a huge fan of this show, so it's an honor to be here, and with you and Michael and Sandra Weber, who is joining us from the Adirondack Mountains in New York, and her impact on my thinking about the statue will come up later. So it's really great to have her here. But how did I get into history? So I think, this is kind of like a process that began in law school. And I went to law school after getting my PhD. And the motivation for going to law school was I'm very much drawn to the applicability to see philosophy in the wild, in action, that is going beyond thought experiments and hypotheticals, which are very sort of characteristic of analytic philosophy. But I was always drawn to the applicability of it. And law is one place where you see not only the application of logic, but also the application of ideas. Like, for example, human dignity, you see being worked out in the law. So law school was shifted things for me because it made me very much aware of the importance of actual facts, which you can do philosophy with really, no understanding of actual facts or history because it's so abstract. And so that began a sort of shift, if you will, to paying attention to facts. And it was in law school that I was exposed to something called international law and exposed to the International Criminal Court. And that got me to go to The Hague, the Netherlands. And it was really in The Hague where I encountered stories that I had never heard before, historical stories about the peace through law movement that really struck me. Like, I remember being it's like when Bertha von Suttner learns about the peace movement, I've spoken about this repeatedly on this show. In her memoirs, she has a chapter titled "There is a Peace Movement," and when she learns about it, and I think she's like 40 years old when she learns about it, she's just shocked that such a thing exists, and she's immediately drawn into the movement. And I think that a similar thing happened to me, that I saw the Peace Palace in The Hague, built in 1913 with funds by Andrew Carnegie. And I just wanted to learn more. And so that got me into the history of the Peace Through Law movement. And I had always been interested in the suffrage movement. But this got me even more into that, because I started to understand the connections between the suffrage movement and the Peace Through Law movement and the international dimensions of the suffrage movement. So yeah, I'll credit it to law school and a sort of like shift to actual facts, and then a class in law school that compelled me to go abroad and visit The Hague. And that's when things really started to change for me. And that was the first time I went to The Hague was in 2010. Yeah. So yeah.
So let's keep building there. So you make it to The Hague in 2010, and you're first you get kind of blown away by this whole world, right? 'Cause The Hague being this sort of international capital of the planet, and as far as I'm concerned, but there's clearly all this infrastructure there to create like an international legal world. And so how long does it take until you start kind of building your own projects that are largely in The Hague?
Not long at all. The very first time I went to The Hague in 2010, I went to the International Criminal Court. I sat in on a case in which it was a very good day and to sit in on a case, because sometimes it's very boring. But on this occasion, we got very lucky, and there was a child witness testifying. And I was blown away. My husband was blown away. It was just so intense emotionally and also intense intellectually. And I thought, this is just an ideal educational experience. I mean, I'm so impacted. My husband, who's also, highly educated, so impacted. And I thought this would just be great for students. And I started asking around the court, is there ever a class that comes in here and studies the court extensively? Because we would sit in on this trial, and we would see classes come in for like an hour and then they would leave. But the International Criminal Court is not just what happens in the courtroom. There's all this other stuff going on. There's the United States relationship to it. It's this larger story, and it's a larger story regarding also peace and human rights. And the answer was no, there was no class. And so I just was like, this is what I have to do. I have to build a class. And so that was the first thing I, quote, built in The Hague. But then I started organizing events in The Hague. And the first one I organized was in 2012. And that was to mark the 10-year anniversary of the International Criminal Court. And that sort of was my first, very first time I did what I call performance history, or sort of like a SWAT team for history, where you go in with a project and a team, and you draw attention to a moment that is connected to the Peace Through Law movement. So that began in 2012, and I did it every year until 2020 when COVID hit. And so actually, I'll just stop there.
Well, that's perfect. I mean, so every year something occurred in The Hague
Or in Korea.
or in Korea, or I was there when
or in Italy.
these things moved to Italy. There was an excursion in Vienna, right? So
Yep.
you've made it all over doing these little SWAT team adventures. And just to color in some of the details, I mean, you start these kinds of projects years in advance, and you have like these stories that you're chasing through an archive. and you're digging through these old books or these old newspaper collections or something, and you know you're pulling these stories out of basically out of the dark. And I mean, I stress that because, you know, the Cora di Brazzà Foundation's objective, so to speak, is to bring these untold stories forward. And you personally are doing the unearthing process of many of them in fundamental ways. And so I just want to like stress that, like, okay, well, where are these ideas coming from? Where are these historical moments coming from? Well, they're coming from old stories that are getting dug out of an archive.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, we have Sandra Weber on the line, and so, the statue itself, I didn't unearth that story, so to speak. That story, I think, really was properly unearthed by Sandra in her book, which we'll talk about later. But what I'm doing, I guess, is in some cases where there has been unearthing, I'm drawing attention to it through a kind of event or a masterclass, but also connecting it to other things, which that moment or that event had not hitherto been connected. So that may be a new thing I'm doing, but yeah, I'll leave it there.
So I suspect we'll end up sort of circling back to that, but I want to drill in and get to an example of one of these moments, right? I know it's something we talked about before we started, and in May of 2017, there was an example of this that kind of paints the picture quite well
Mm,
for
mm,
like how these stories begin to develop. Like the seeds of a story were planted in May of 2017.
mm.
So what was going on, what was going on during that spring?
Well, yeah, I just want to go back to like the seeds were planted earlier, indeed. And actually, what happened in May of 2017 arose out of something that happened in 2015, where I reached out to the Sewell Belmont House, now called the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. Same building, just different name, and now within the ambit of the National Park Service. Before it was not within the National Park Service universe. But I had reached out to them because, as you know, Randy, I work a lot with this old flag from 1897, which, by the way, we're raising here at Central Michigan University on Thursday. Um, and that flag has the same colors as the colors of the National Woman's Party, which is purple, white, and gold. This flag that I work with is before, I mentioned this last time. So the peace flag is created in 1897, and the colors of the National Woman's Party come into existence around 1913. So the peace flag is older. And these colors also are adopted by the International Council of Women, which is founded by Susan B. Anthony, and May Wright Sewell, really, but Susan B. Anthony, on the 40th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention, creates the International Council of Women, and they eventually adopt these colors well before the National Woman's Party. So there's this sort of like weird leitmotif of these colors being associated with women, and the as I mentioned last time, the constitution of the International Council of Women, the whole purpose of that is to eradicate all forms of injustice and ignorance everywhere. And it was not solely focused on suffrage, and really you see the peace movement coming to be formed within this International Council of Women. And it's really Cora di Brazzà who's doing it in early subcommittees. In any case, I was very intrigued about this connection, these colors, and like, what's the story there? That's basically the question. What is the story? And I reached out to the Sewell Belmont House because it was just time, I mean, the voice in my head had been saying, pursue, go there, visit them. And so I finally reached out to them through email. Um, they they were like, oh, this is so interesting. And by the way, like ironically enough, someone is writing a blog on the colors right now. And you could do a blog post as well. Would you do that? And so I did that in I think it was October 2015. And so I had some connection with the Sewall Belmont House. I had never visited them, but I wrote this blog post, which has since been removed because all their old website was removed when the Sewall Belmont House became the new entity that it is. But I think you can go on Wayback Machine and find that blog post. It's called The Dignity of Continuity, which is a phrase that Maywright Sewall uses. And so I then finally went to go visit them in 2016 and did some research. And in 2017, which is what you're asking. So my point is, like, 2017 didn't just happen. It was emerging from earlier work. In 2017, I did a talk at the Sewall Belmont House with Stephanie Foster about the linkages between the suffrage and the peace through law movement. And it was really cool because they had, a National Women's Party flag displayed, and I had a peace flag displayed. And we talked about the linkages, which really nobody knew about in that audience. If you go onto Twitter, you can find a picture of that. And that was in 2017, around the time of Peace Day, which was May 18th. And so we spoke about that and what it meant, and how women were involved, how the International Council of Women was involved, et cetera. And all of this predates the National Women's Party. So that's why we're there. I think I'm answering that question finally.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that I was theirs, right? So I have a lot of the story that you're sharing too. But for people who weren't there, it might be useful just to hit the bullet points to give the big frame. I mean, we went we went to DC for a couple of reasons. One was to actually spend time with the people at the Seawall Belmont House, and you gave a presentation there, and then uh, we went to the US Capitol, and we went to go see the portrait monument, right? Because like we went on the public tour in order to actually go and see what that structure was and actually be in its presence directly. And we took the peace flag with us. The objective was like, let's link history together. Now, a bunch of things happened when we got into that building, and I think it's best if I let you unpack what some of them were. But
You can go
so,
ahead.
well, okay. So, well, in that case, one of the things that's so fascinating was that we wanted to bridge these stories together and bring the peace flag into a visual field of the statue. I mean, at least for us, right? At least for our own mind and organizing thoughts. But we got in there and found out that there were two things that we had no information about before going in. The first was, well, there was no explicit explanation that we weren't allowed to have another flag inside of that room. And so we were, confronted by the security, the Capitol Police, and they began to basically ask us to leave because we weren't allowed to have another flag in the room. And Hope attempted to humanize this conflict by talking with the person and requesting his name and explaining the situation, but that was basically pointless. But in that moment, there was something else that was really striking, because we saw for the first time the POW MIA flag being flown in that room. And that moment sparked a whole bunch of things too. And I'm trying to stress this because, it's an example of one of these moments where in the process of pursuing one story, another story seems to show itself in some cool way. So how much did I leave out there?
I think that sounds great. We were also with a pretty sizable delegation from Central Michigan University that included 2 professors, Andrew Blom, who's now the chairperson of the Department of Philosophy and Religion, Cherie Strawn in the Department of Political Science, the then Dean Pamela Sue Gates, and several students, yourself, and some others as well as an alum. Bryn was there, who was living in DC. She was an alum of the Hague class. So it was a pretty sizable delegation. I don't think she was at the statue though, but she was at the talk, Bryn was.
Right.
And yeah, we were all kicked out. And as you said, when I tried to humanize the situation with the security guard by giving him, so we had printed out the inscription on the piece of paper that you mentioned at the beginning of the show. We read it, and I was like pointing it out to him, like the sort of significance of the statue, and it just made him more furious. Like he just wanted us to go.
Right.
And yeah, so like when he said to me, no flags are allowed in here, you know, within my field of vision was the POW MIA flag. And I said, but there's a flag right there. And that flag looked, you know, the POW MIA flag is a black flag. It's not exactly, you know, of a classical design, if you will. And it really looked odd in the rotunda. And it stuck out to me. And he said, that flag is there through congressional approval. And to get a flag in here, you have to have congressional approval and this kind of thing. And that just stuck to me. And so that's a conversation for another day. But yeah.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I'm stressing that because over the next 4 years, that flag became something that we learned about and talked about a lot on this show, because the story associated with Evelyn Grubb and the Grubb family and all of that associated with the League of Families, like that was a huge story. That was a really great thing to learn about. And that all occurred in the very same 5-minute pocket.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I don't know if that's like a serendipity thing, a synchronicity thing. I don't have the right word for it, but it's like those are the kinds of moments where these stories seem to unfold, at least in the stuff that I've been around.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. And I think that Sandra maybe want to chime in a minute, but I mean, this point about this other story revealed itself when we were there. And I think that's just a fact of research, that when you're in an archive or you're pursuing something, but especially when you're in an archive, you're looking for something. I mean, Sandra's story about how she stumbles upon the statue is because she's focused on Edna St. Vincent Millay, if I recall, and she's like reading a footnote or something.
Yes.
But yeah, so like you're focused on something else, and then you find this, and I just think that's like you're sort of like in this space where you're awake and paying attention, and these things pop into it, and I just think that's a fact of research. Sandra, do you want to?
Yes, absolutely. And I was wondering, you probably told me before, but I don't remember. How is it that the statue itself popped into your frame? How did you become aware of it and tie it in with things? Was it when you were at the Sewell Belmont House?
Yeah, you know, I'm trying to remember exactly how it came in. And the best I can do is that I began doing research in the Library of Congress National Women's Party papers. Okay. And what I was looking for was a linkage between like the colors of the National Women's Party flag and the peace flag. That's what I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And I came across, you know, letters and pictures and things about the statue. And I think it was through those archives that I really became drawn in. And as I mentioned before we went live, I bought your book, Sandra, on December 23rd, 2016, when I was in DC doing research. And so I think like, I was like, okay, I need to learn more about this statue. Here's the book. And yeah, that was 2016. And then it became an important thing for me as I learned about the statue, because I'm always trying to find objects that tell stories. And this is the statue is a preeminent information delivery device. And it's a preeminent information delivery device for the purposes of the centenary of the 19th Amendment. So I was really working on my thinking about the centenary really beginning in like 2017. I usually work a year or two in advance. And so that became more and more. And then it was like, I need to make this replica for that. And so that's the sort of backstory. But yeah, I was sort of drawn into the papers because of the flag. Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you had made the connection of Susan B. Anthony and May Wright Sewell and Adelaide Johnson, the sculptress of the statue, all being very close friends.
Yeah, I knew that. And I knew that, and I can't remember like when this was uncovered, but I had started to, I did research on the International Council of Women, like before I went to the Library of Congress. And so I was aware of that, but I mean, still to this day, I haven't pursued those relationships, those friendships. But you know, Adelaide Johnson was a member of the International Council of Women. But yeah, it just I was aware, but it's still something I need to bring to my consciousness, to be honest.
Well, I just wanted to throw in one more kind of strange thing that I just remembered that I didn't put in the book, is that while Adelaide Johnson is over in Italy creating the portrait monument, she has sculpted a model of May Wright Sewell, but she's never put it into marble. And she's being hassled by, I don't remember who, somebody back in the US, that while you're over there, you know, put May Wright Sewell into marble. And Adelaide Johnson's just like, I don't have time to think about this, you know, I'm creating this monument. Yeah.
I mean, May Wright Sewell was the main bridge that like brought the whole conversation to my life. I mean, Hope walked me into the archives back in 2014. It's like, hey, you want to? And we pulled these massive scrapbooks of May Wright Sewell out, and that's where like the whole concept of the peace flag showed up in my life for the first time in any meaningful way. And it's like, yeah, so May Wright Sewell and potential. So I guess on the subject of the statue itself, Hope, I'd like to zoom in on that a little bit more, because you know you've talked about how this particular statue for inspiring and connecting this story together for people. And so I guess the question I want to ask is, you know, is there anything about the statue that specifically seems to propel you into, you know, action about sharing or doing something? Like, there's something about the statue that looks like we might have a connection issue.
Yeah, but the connection is very bad on my end. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're all set now.
Okay, yeah. So what I got was, is there something specific about the statue that that propelled me into action? Is that correct?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, the statue is a bundle of stories. That's its intrigue, that it is a bundle. So I was very intrigued about the inscription being removed. The inscription itself I found incredible. Just that itself requires, you know, a class or two to go through the inscription. The fact that it was removed, the three individuals who are depicted in the statue, who they are, how they are all involved in the abolition movement, those linkages. So it's really, again, it's like the fact that the statue is a bundle of stories. And it's a visual object. So all of those things, it's like, your question is sort of like, is there one thing about the Peace Palace that makes it,
Yeah, fair.
yeah,
Fair.
and the Peace Palace is a nest of stories. It is a story nest, and it's the same thing with the statue.
So it's that fact, the fact that it, it requires so much, there's so much in it that it ought to be shared. It ought to be a story that's told, something like that. Is that kind of what
Yeah.
motivates you to recreate and actually generate these, what ends up becoming these replicas?
Yeah, it's not just because there's a lot there, it's the stories that are there. So the specific stories, the specific nest of stories that are in the statue, absolutely.
So it just seems like a natural place to pivot to actually discussing that project and that process. Um, so let's go there. So when did you actually decide that you wanted to try to do the impossible, so to speak, and actually pull this statue into something that's deliverable, that's shareable, that's mobile? And could you talk about like when did that start and what was going on in your head at the time?
Well, I mean, I can't remember the precise details. It was in 2019, and 2019, you were there in Korea with me. It was very, very important year in terms of excavating untold stories, because 2019 is the 100th anniversary of Korea's March 1st movement of 1919, which happens, during the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, and so all this like World War I, Korea before the division of Korea in 1945, like I was coming off of that, and I was realizing, okay, I need to start focusing on the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which was 2020. And so it was really the summer of 2019 when I was in The Hague. I was like, now's the time. I had Sandra's book with me, because I knew that I need to start thinking about what I'm going to be doing for the centenary of the 19th Amendment. And I was talking about, making the replica with people. And I just remember like sending off an email and like, yeah, can it be done? Can I find a place to do it? And that's the first thing you do is like, well, like, where do I start? Start before you're ready. And yeah, I sent off the email and away we went.
Yeah, so okay, I'm gonna do a little loop here. You know, earlier we were talking about uh the experiences we had in DC at the Seawall Belmont House, and I remember we were on the second floor of that structure when you introduced me to Sandra's book, actually,
Mm.
and you were showing me a picture of the oxen and the cart, or is there something like that, right? And you were saying like look at the work associated with just moving the thing, right? And the thousands of things that probably were difficult about that actual, just the physical repositioning of the final product, let alone the creation of it. And I bring that up because I know that the actual generation of this replica it took a few tries. Like there was things that didn't go so well. And so could you walk through kind of some of the challenges that showed up that were impossible to predict?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been doing like creating things ex nihilo for some years now, so I'm accustomed to things going wrong, and that's why you have to start well in advance. You have to have a margin of error because things always go wrong. Expect the unexpected. Expect that it's not going to go. So the thing is, I really wanted the inscription on the statue. I really wanted the inscription. Like if I'm going to do this, do it right. Because if this is the purpose of the replica is really to be able to teach and to transmit stories, and you need to have the inscription there. And the first company that I contracted said that they could do it. No problem. We agreed on a size, and the size was, I mean, the original size was about 12 inches. Now the statue is 24. The final product, which is now done with a different artist, is 24 inches high, so twice the size. But originally, the first company said, we can do this. We could make it about 12 inches. We could have this inscription. I sent them the inscription. We could do it, no problem. And then as it got closer to actually, like, they were working with a company, because a separate company has to make the plate, you know, the inscription, the lettering. So there's like one person who does the sculpting, and then a totally different company makes the inscription and then has to be inserted onto the sculpture. When they started talking with that company, which is like quite late in the production process, and that sort of bothered me. Like, why didn't you discuss this with them at the outset and then tell me we can do this? But anyway, they said that according to, you know, the printing company, that this really can't be done at this size. You won't be able to read the inscription. This thing is going to have to be bigger and heavier. And that's not what they told me. And so I was upset at that. And so really the inscription at all levels made the thing more complicated than it could have been. And that's true for Adelaide Johnson. I mean, she added this inscription at the end, and she didn't have enough time to chisel it into the statue. And so she quickly stenciled it on, but it always meant to be chiseled into the statue. And this was a sort of like, it came to her, I guess, towards the end to put it on the statue. Although, as Sandra has pointed out, this inscription, she had been working on this for a number of years, but it was never agreed that the inscription would be part of the statue that goes into the rotunda. That was sort of like, surprise. And so the inscription is its own, story and interesting thing. And as we've said on this show, Adelaide Johnson intentionally put it on the back because she didn't want people to be, quote, distracted by a bunch of words, and she wanted people to look at the faces of the pioneers. And again, I love this, you know, the thinker and student will find the inscription. Like those people who really like study the statue and so forth, the thinker and student will find the inscription. I'm putting it on the back, and maybe, you know, the masses won't see it, but the thinker and student will find it. And I just think I love that.
Yeah, that's about perfect. And I mean, and so, you know, at the end of this adventure here, I mean, the replica statues are completed and the inscription is in place and it is legible.
It is.
So perfect. I mean, there we go. The impossible was done.
Well,
And
you know, I mean, to be honest, you know, I was just like, if we can send a man to the moon, like, it's just, if we could make a drone, you know, we can figure out how to put this inscription on this like, it's just, this is not a very complex, like, there needs to be some, you know, deliberation and thinking, but this is not so complex. And I was just convinced that you could absolutely do this. We just had to find the right people. Yeah.
so, could you unpack a little bit about, like, I mean, this is going backwards a little, but I'm interested in kind of just going into the decision-making process about recreating a replica statue instead of, you know, writing another book about the statue, or, you know, making some kind of other awareness campaign. Like there's 100 ways that this could have been, you know, the story could have gotten out, so to speak, but you chose the replica statue. I'm interested, is there anything in there that is worth pulling out?
Well, first of all, the the best book has been written, and that's Sandra's book. So no need to, write a book about the statue. Uh, and it is a kind of, doing this is a kind of field research, if you will. So I consider it part of, a research, part of research, field research or something like this. So I've learned so much, making the statue. And then, as you know, Randy, I actually like made a book I brought to press, and I actually like physically, I didn't hire a publisher. I made the book of Bertha's first ever translation of The Barbarization of the Sky, and I learned so much. And my objective is always, learning as much as I can. And yeah, so I gain from that process of doing something that needs to be done, quite frankly. The statue needs to be made. There's like replicas of Susan B. Anthony, there's replicas of Martin Luther King. There's all these replicas, but not of this statue. So that needs to be done. I would buy it, and I have. I have bought the statue. so so that's why a lot of things get created in the United States, because someone sees a need. And so I saw a need, and that's why I did it. I think Sandra maybe has something to say.
Well, I was just going to say, I remember the first day that I received your email telling me that you were making a replica statue, and I just couldn't believe it. I was like so thrilled. It was like beyond my wildest dreams. Because I remember early on that I also thought, how can I, go out and lecture about this statue, and especially like in schools, and that I need some kind of a model or something to actually have them connect with this, and the only thing I could come up with was like to cut up pieces of cardboard and like recreate sections of the monument and have them like put these blocks of marble together to build the statue. And your solution is so much more elegant than mine, and I'm just so thankful that you went ahead and did this.
Thanks. Although, it's kind of like hard to transport, because it is large and heavy. It's about, 25 pounds and 24 inches. I can lift it, and I'm pretty small. I'm petite, as we say.
Yes.
I can lift it, but my original vision was to have, yeah, something that you could tote around. I could put it in my carry-on and bring it out when I'm I'm on the plane and stare at it. And bring it into a classroom, and children could have it in their bedroom. That was my original vision, but in fact, you really can't do that, not with the material that it's in now. So I did have a mold made, and what's nice about having the mold is that I could make it acrylic, I could make it clear, I could make it rubber. The rubber would be, I guess, quite light. Yeah. So I could make it hot pink. So once you have the mold, you can pour any sort of material into it. Then, of course, can you put the inscription on rubber? Interesting question. But you see, this is the kind of thing, and I'm working with this wonderful artist who loves art, and she loves the challenges that the statue presents, and she's willing to experiment. And we did experiment with the lettering. Like, she tried different techniques with the gold, because it's gold leafing. So she it's almost like a kind of watercolor technique, where she's putting on the gold leafing on the lettering and sanding the things away. It's like, takes about 12 hours to do this by hand, but she's willing to do that, and other things. So yes, I believe, I remember emailing you, Sandra, and I was in The Hague when I did that, and it was right around the time when I was like, okay, I'm now entering like the March 1st Korea nonviolent uprising against Japanese colonialism. It's like, I've commemorated that. Now I got to start focusing on the 19th Amendment. And so I've been wanting to contact you for a long time. And that was I remember such things very clearly. It was delightful to hear from you, and even more delightful to have you involved and on the call with me now. It's pure magic.
It is, and I'm been learning so much more, and you have kept this alive for me. So thank you.
Oh, my honor. Yeah.
I want to just dig as far in here as possible. I mean, because the two of you are basically the best people who can be asked about such a thing. But I'm really interested to see about weaving together two ideas and then using the statue as the centerpiece. On the one hand, we have this object, this material item, which clearly has some way of linking together the peace movement and the women's suffrage movement and the stories of the individuals involved in this historical narrative. And like we have all of that in the past, and then we have this recreation and the rediscovery of the story and the subsequent recreation of those moments that the two of you, Hope and Sandra, are kind of at the tip of the spear on. And I'm really curious to know, like, having done all of this, does it feel like you're more involved in like there's a deeper connection between those stories and you now, having done all of the work, and then similarly, like, would you imagine that this potentially deeper sort of felt sense of connection to these stories and the identification with them would be something that a lot of other people could tap into?
And
I guess Hope first.
yeah, I'll go first, I guess. I'm pretty deep into these stories. I mean, I've learned more, but it's all about a feeling. There's a feeling that I get when I'm doing this kind of research and deep thinking and creation. And I know that feeling, and I know that I need to follow it. And yeah, it's magical. It brings, it connects me to people, to ideas, to stories, to so do we call it deeper? We could call it that, but I would say like the feeling is the same. Yeah. I don't feel like the feeling is more intense. So yeah, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but
Yeah, I mean, of
yeah.
course.
Okay.
I mean, I'll ask it again in a different way in a second, but I want to see if Sandra can volley on that one.
Alrighty.
Are you ready for me?
Please, please.
So maybe it's broader connections, in the sense that, like, I didn't necessarily connect the statue with the peace movement so much because it just wasn't in my background. And so now I'm seeing this whole other connection that the monument and that Adelaide Johnson had, that another story of it that I didn't see before. I'm also seeing the connections between a lot of these people that I didn't realize the importance of, that this person knew this person, and what that really meant in a bigger sense. And I think part of that is that you can only deal with so much information at one time, and so you just keep broadening out and following the little trails off to the side, and so it just becomes, again, I don't know if I'd say deeper connection, but just this wider, and sort of the picture just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And sharing those stories, yeah, I don't know how many people are going to be interested in the fact of exactly, how much the mallet weighed that the guy was using to, hammer out the piece of marble. But I'm interested in how much that mallet weighed. So I don't know how far the stories can go or not.
I love that. I guess the thing I'm driving towards is trying to pin down something like a broad function that a connection to history plays. And we've talked about it on this show many times about like the need to belong and the need to feel a connection to our historical identity in some way. And so I'm driving towards this question about like, whether this statue seems to have made this connection feel, in some way completed, or I guess the word would be what the needs get satisfied or met. The needs get met. And whether or not that seems like it's true. I mean, I know the answer is yes, but like unpacking that a little bit is kind of where I'm driving.
Sandra, do you want to take that first?
Why don't you jump in first?
Okay, well, so yes, I think, as you know, Randy, and this is on the, I think, website of the Cora di Brazzà Foundation, like what's our mission? And it's to excavate untold stories and thereby satisfy the need to belong. And, I need to actually rewrite that because it's becoming more clear to me as I think harder about what it is that we're doing, that I'm doing. And I mentioned this a little bit on our last shows. So there's like the psychological need to belong, but there's also a psychological need for narrative. That is like when you have a narrative of your life, that is when you see your life as part of a bigger project, and you're able to make the connection between your very small time here on Earth and some larger effort, that this is associated with well-being. And this is Dan McAdams' work on what's called the Redemptive Self, and that he has shown that people who are able to craft such narratives and see their work as part of this larger project are able, like, score more highly on, well-being and so forth, or versus people who just have a kind of episodic, they don't really see their lives as part of some larger narrative of redemption, of going from better to worse kind of thing. So there are people who have those narratives, and I think that, we're better off when we have a narrative where we're able to plug our effort into some larger picture. And absolutely, this work does that for me. That is, I can, see my effort and my labor and my energy, just the small bit I can do, like at least, draw people's attention to these stories, which, as I've mentioned, are quite nourishing for me and help satisfy my need to belong as a woman. It really helps to learn about other women who are working on these projects and encountering obstacles, difficulties, and persisting nonetheless. I just find that extremely comforting, and it helps assuage my existential angst. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but yeah, the general thing that plugging into positive history does, because we call it positive history. This is not, the history of atrocities. And there can be positive history that arises out of atrocity. So we can talk about that as well, but a sort of like redemptive spin. Dan McAdams calls it a redemptive sequence, that I can take this suffering and I can learn from it. Being able to do that and connect yourself to historical stories of that, I think that's the sort of grand function of these stories, period.
Awesome. I guess same question to you, Sandra, just
Yes.
for rounding it out.
Well, I concur with everything that Hope said, but I wanted to add kind of a personal note that, you know, you never know where a project is going to take you, of course, and where it's going to go, who you're going to meet, but inevitably through the research, you're going to, you know, meet so many wonderful people and hear so many great stories and things. But I didn't realize until after the statue book came out in 2016 that I feel like there was a very big reason for me to have gone through that process and to know that enormous amount of history of the national suffrage movement in great detail. And I feel that it allowed me to craft a narrative of what women had been through, what the movement had been through. And that is precisely what was needed in 2017. And with the women's marches and the circumstances that we found ourselves in, I realized that I had been placed in a position where I could explain how certain things had happened before in history and how they had been overcome, or, you know, what we did the last time this happened. And this narrative, I think, for me at least, I know, and for other people, it gave us some hope of, wow, look at what these women went through, and, you know, and they moved forward, and we can do it too, and we can show our power. So for me, that was one of the really, really incredible gifts that I had at that moment in time to bring this history right into the very present moment.
Wow. Well, it doesn't get bigger than that as far as I'm concerned. That's as deep as it can go. Michael, I know you're still with us here. Is there anywhere that you wanted to dive in a little deeper? And
Yeah,
get some Go ahead.
the one thing that has been sort of ricocheting around in my brain, and Sandra had touched on this, was just what I was going to ask Hope as well. Since the recreation of the replica statues and the shows and other educational efforts that have been conducted to get this history out there, what has been the impact on other individuals, individuals who were entirely ignorant of this history? If you had any interactions with that, where it was the first time they had ever encountered this, and what their reaction was. And Sandra touched on this, where in the moment of time we were in 2017, that it gave a lot of individuals hope and gave them this moral energy to propel them through the circumstances we were all facing, that these individuals could overcome so much, and if they can do it, then so we can do it. So I was just curious if Hope or Sandra, you had any other particulars that you wanted to touch on of the impact that this statue has had on individuals sort of outside of this realm of people who had come to know it.
I mean, I can't answer that question. I only operate in the realm of people who know it, and just I just haven't been able to, sort of bring it out there yet because of COVID and so forth. So my experience sort of connecting people with the statue has been very, very limited. I have not been able to, do that kind of outreach. The statue was finished on February 15th of this year, so it's been, like 2 months, and I haven't been able to do anything with it.
I guess not quite addressing your question, but one of the things I have found fascinating is I have picked up on the forward into light phrase. And I've been using that for many, many years in relationship to Inez Milholland, because in the first suffrage parade she was in New York City, and I forget if it was 1911 or 1912, but she helped carry that banner, the Forward into Light banner. And so when I discovered that Hope, completely independent before we knew each other, was also using the Forward into Light message, of course, I am just immediately felt this connection. And I have taken the Forward into Light. I had a Forward into Light banner made, and I have used it, taken it to marches in Washington, D.C. and local marches throughout the Adirondacks. And it's just a message that I think so speaks to people. Forward out of error. Yeah, we can understand that, forward out of darkness. And so I'm so fascinated by the Forward into Light message. And I don't know if Hope wants to speak a little bit about how she connected to that.
I actually would like to jump in on that specific point. And then obviously I don't want to cut off Hope here, but I know that same period where we were talking about earlier today, where we were in DC, one of the activities was going into the Library of Congress and actually looking at some of the archival footage. Like there was microfilm that we were looking at, and one of the slides that I remember being exposed to, and I don't know if it was actually on the microfilm or if it was something that got like extracted and then shown like later that day, but what it was the actual demonstrations out in front of the White House with the whole, I don't know if it's a poem or what, but the Forward out of darkness idea in the old archival film, black and white color, or black and white like image. Like that was my first exposure to it. Was in the same week, this whirlwind week back in 2017, and so I just wanted to like plug into the forward out of darkness, forward into light idea. It's like that all came at the same time as the rest of the story that we've been discussing, and it's so amazing to me. So learning about some of the stuff that happened as demonstrations in front of the White House, it's really, it blows my mind to see the progression of demonstrations like that, how they started and what they, like how cool they used to be, the things Alice Paul used to do. It just blows my mind.
Yes, and if I could just add a little bit to that, how the reason one of the banners there said Forward into Light was, again, that was in tribute to Inez Milholland, who had died in November of 1916 as she was campaigning across the country for women's votes. And she worked so hard, and she had pernicious anemia, and she actually died out in California during this campaign. And the National Women's Party appealed to Woodrow Wilson and said, isn't this ridiculous that talented, educated, women like this are actually literally dying over votes for women. And Wilson, I don't remember, he mumbled something and he actually walked out of the room from the National Women's Party delegates who were there. And the delegates were so upset that the very next day is when they took up their banners and did the Silent Sentinel thing out in front of the White House to protest. So this is all tied together.
Wow. So I guess I want to make sort of a soft landing here, because we have been going for about an hour, a little over an hour. But I wanted to make one more explicit pass past the connection between the women's suffrage movement and the peace through law movement. I wanted to really drive that point home using the statue. I mean, one of the things that we've touched on a whole bunch of times in the last couple of weeks talking about it is that these people all seemed to know each other, right? The people spearheading the women's suffrage movement had a very deep relationship and role to play in the peace through law movement, and especially when we're talking about the United States, right? It was actually basically the same people on the same on the committees associated with both movements, at least in the 1890s. And of course, I'm generalizing, but I was wondering if we could, you know, iron out one detail associated with the intersection between those two movements, whether it's discussing, something about the flag or something, or the peace flag, or something about the statue that, that seems to bring into consciousness the, I guess the word that comes to my mind is glory, but maybe it isn't right. It's like the radiance of the idea, the brilliance of the idea that, like, bringing women into a seat at the negotiating table has a relationship to peace globally, something like that. There's like this grand narrative in there that I want to just throw out there as a place to explore before we wrap up.
I can speak to that. So yeah, I'm just going to speak to a very specific intersection between the peace through law movement and you said women's suffrage movement, but let's zoom out and let's talk about the International Council of Women, which was broader than suffrage. And as you know, Randy, the whole purpose of this organization was to eliminate what we would call today the silos of women's work. And there was a recognition by May Wright Sewall and Susan B. Anthony that women are working, they're working to make the world a better place. And we should be efficient, and we shouldn't be reduplicating efforts, and let's have a more systematic approach to this energy that we're bringing to the project of uplift. And so in 1899, which is when you have the very first Hague Peace Conference, the International Council of Women is meeting in London. So The Hague, Netherlands, London. Susan B. Anthony is there. And this is the very first time that the International Council adopts a resolution. And the resolution that they adopt is to fully support the arbitration movement. Now, this is important because suffrage at the time in 1899 was still considered like somewhat radical and controversial. And so this is one of the reasons why the International Council of Women was created. So we're not requiring people to support suffrage. We have a more broader objective, which is to eradicate ignorance and injustice. And so if you don't want to go there through suffrage, that's fine. If you want to go there through arbitration or temperance, etc., that's fine. But this, I think it's striking because this was an idea that everybody could sign up to, this idea of let's no longer solve our disputes with violence, and let's do it through arbitration, a nonviolent method. And as we have discussed repeatedly, that involves organizing the world, and that involves creating new courts, new processes, creating spaces where states can go and discuss their disagreements, etc. So that's 1899. And one of Susan B. Anthony's my most favorite of her quotes that I've encountered is when she's talking about the International Council of Women at that meeting. She says something like, there's too much focus on the I and not enough on the you. So we're so focused on ourselves and not the other. And I love that. And I think that relates so beautifully to the statue, because as Sandra pointed out in her book, I mean, when Susan B. Anthony sees her statue recreated by Adelaide Johnson for the 1893 World's Fair, she says, I can't go to the fair by myself. You need to create Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And then we know the story. So Susan B. Anthony is like, yeah, I'm going to the fair. My statue's going, haha. No, she knows that it's not just her, and she's focused on the others involved in the movement. And of course, those others were focused on other others, that is slaves. And so I just think like though that phrase is stated in 1899. So that moment, that very specific moment, brings together, I think, so many things into our consciousness about this linkage. And it's Bertha von Suttner who's supposed to make the motion, but she ends up not going to, she's supposed to speak at that meeting, but she ends up not going and staying in The Hague. And so someone makes the motion on her behalf. And I'm done with that story.
Well, that's the best answer possible for the question I asked. So I wanna start to wrap things up, but before we get to the going around, Michael, I was wondering if you had any final kind of questions before we go to the reflection portion.
No, I think everything, I was happy to, because one of my favorite little linkages in all of this story is your forcible removal from the Capitol Rotunda, and just that image of the appeal to this authority with, you know, getting the Capitol officer's name to try to reason with him and, you know, go past the veneer of authority and titles and different positions that everyone holds and try to speak to the person. I don't know, I love that. Like, that is something that whenever we discuss the portrait monument, it always comes to me, because it is just so emblematic of what this movement is. And so, no, my moral tank has been completely filled. So I could not think of a better way to spend a later Monday afternoon into early Monday afternoon.
Perfect. Well, in that case, I guess let's go around and do final thoughts. I'll go first, and then Michael, if anything comes to mind real quick for you to say aside from what you just said, and then Sandra, if you'd go after that, and then Hope will have the last word today. So for me, we spent a lot of time on this show talking about like the role of physical objects as tangible things which stimulate a sense of meaning in people in ways that, like, so long as there's some small amount of information about the story, the object itself seems to inspire us in some deep way to pursuing more knowledge about a story, to really dig in. And I know that that's been repeatedly true in my own life, and learning more and more about the role that this statue has played in both Sandra and Hope's life, and hopefully now that it's portable is something that's going to play a role in more people's lives. It's very inspiring to me. So I'm very interested in more people having a felt sense of meaning in their lives, and this connection to history is something that's becoming more and more distant. And so I see this particular statue and the stories associated with it as a remedy to a very deep sickness in our world, and I'm optimistic that there's a medicine on the way, so to speak. So that's all for me. Any final thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, to just kind of continue off your point of the importance of these physical objects, the inundation with someone with new ideas, either being communicated through these objects or in other ways, really speaks to, it's something that I've really, throughout this beginning of 2021 and even at the end of last year, was the first democratically elected mayor, Shinzo Hamai of Hiroshima, after the bombings in 1945. He gives his mayoral declaration on August 6, 1947, 2 years to the day of the bombing, and he speaks to how this horrific event has constituted a revolution of thought for the individuals of Hiroshima and hopefully for the whole world, in that through having experienced and gone through something so utterly horrific that kind of just puts up a stark mirror to civilization as a whole, that through this sort of, in Japan's case, this whole through the 20th century, this idea of imperial conquest, the domination of the people of Korea, of China, of most of Southeast Asia, and finally culminating in the Empire of Japan's defeat at the end of the Second World War, and then the horrific nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that something's got to change, that we cannot take these bombings that we've endured and then continue this cycle of violence. There's this concept in political science called blowback, where you have a perceived wrong done onto you, so you must retaliate. And then the other side will feel harmed, and so then they must retaliate against you. And it's just a death spiral of conflict and the disease of the animalistic part of the human mind. And so I feel that the portrait monument and many objects that communicate this positive history constitute revolutions of thought on an individualistic scale. And that's certainly something I have been picking up on through Randy, yours telling of this experience, and also Hope and then yours as well, Sandra, that these objects put a new lens on life for individuals. They are connections to a higher way of being, a higher way of thinking, one that is more in line with the goals of peace movement as a whole, of the women's movement, of striving towards the better version of humanity that we feel we can be when we adhere to reason, when we have shared mutual bondships amongst each other. And that even though Mayor Shinzo Hamai was talking about the revolution of thought in a very global sense, in a societal sense, that these bombings and now access to this nuclear technology must constitute a shift in perception for the whole of humanity, I feel that that can be done on a very individualistic level as well. And that, for me personally, that has been my biggest takeaway from the history of the portrait monument. And it is still one that continues to resonate with me as well. So no, an immense thanks to you, Hope, and to you, Sandra, for being the individuals on the front line of excavating this history, of being the ones to create and to transmit this, whether through books or through recreations of physical replicas. It's meaningful, it's profound. And I hope as we hopefully exit the pandemic age at some point, that history of that portrait monument can then be communicated to other individuals and help give them a new lens on life, which will then, bit by bit, inch by inch, for the cause of peace for humanity as a whole. So no, I'm very grateful. Thank you very much to you both for coming on today.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Randy. And it's a pleasure for me to do the history, to do the research, and to write. But it's also kind of a lonely process at times, because you're really have to just, for the most part, you're on your own doing this. And to afterwards have the book received by people, and then for me to be part of these conversations that take the monument in different directions than I ever imagined, it's just, I don't even know how to express it, that these dialogues about the monument are just, to me, so powerful and so rich, and enlightening. And I hope that, I hope we can just continue to keep having these, because it is such a great experience. And Adelaide Johnson, who created the statue, I'm sure she had exactly these kinds of conversations in her mind. Thank you.
Well, last thoughts, Hope?
Yeah, thank you for those comments, Sandra and Michael. And Randy, yes, I love the dialogues as well. And yeah, I think that there's always a beginning of a process, you know, when you put something out into the world. And I just, I'll quote him again, Hamza Khan. We've quoted this passage. People in the past all did great things, and they must be strong on a string like beads. Who does the stringing? I must do it. And that goes to these points that we were making about the sort of psychological impact of positive history, the need to create narrative. I think Hamza Khan gets it, like before Dan McAdams does. He gets the importance of looking at history, looking at positive history, and weaving it into a narrative that connects with your life. I also think that these objects are so important because of the fragility of memory. That is, it's like, if you don't, it's almost like we have the phrase stream of consciousness. Things are rushing by. Our memory is very fleeting. It's hard to remember what we did last week. And when you have an object that has persistence and fortitude, it has a weight. It's sort of like it has a weight on your attention. It has a weight on your consciousness. You have to stare at it, and you should think about it. And so these objects also bring into consciousness the ethical dimensions of memory, which we have talked about on this show, the duty to remember, which is a phrase that we use in connection with the POW MIA flag. And so Bertha von Suttner said it, May Wright Sewell said it, that you need these kinds of persistent things to battle this sort of like this just ever changing screen on my head. And so I think that's another value of them, that they command our attention and our focus. And that's what we've been doing. Like, this object causes us to focus on a very specific realm of stories that are very fortifying and nurturing. So those are my last words. Over to you, Randy.
Well, thank you all for being here, and you know, I shared my kind of final reflections earlier, and so I guess you've been listening to Virtues of Peace, and hope to see you all again soon.